Hi, I'm Bay Macfarlane with Mary's Advocates, and we uphold marriage against no-fault divorce and support those who are unjustly abandoned and those who remain faithful to marriage after separation or divorce. The purpose of this video is to give a response to a show that Chris Stefanik did where he had a guest, and they titled their show Divorce, Annulment, and the Catholic Faith, What No One Tells You. Carolyn Klika was his guest, and what I'm going to do here is just try to give a summary of the longer blog with all the written explanation. This video is just for the person who might not ever read the whole blog, and it also gives you the excerpts from their interview to which I'm responding. So here's the first set.
Divorce and annulment are two different things. Give us the 30-second summary of the difference between those two things. And when you meet people who are sold on one but not the others, lots of Catholics who get divorced that don't bother with the annulment process.
Right.
Whereas so many of them have an annullable marriage if they would pursue it.
Yeah.
So give us the distinction and give us a sales pitch for people to consider that process.
God is the author of marriage, not the government. Yeah. We have the sacramental marriage that takes place in the church with God's blessing. And then we have a civil marriage that takes place in the courthouse, right? So we are legally married as well as sacramentally married in the church. So when we civilly divorce, that ends the legal marriage with the government, but the sacramental marriage remains. And so the vows we take at our wedding, it's for better, for worse, until death do us part. Yeah. That's the vow we make. That's how God created marriage.
My issue with Carolyn's description is that she misses way too much of the church's teaching about divorce. Catholics belong to two societies. We belong to the society of the church and the society of the state. And both societies have their own form of governance. And when people marry in the church, they usually also assume the status of being married in the state. Divorce is the process by where one status in the state goes from married to unmarried. And because of no-fault divorce, that happens all the time when there's not a morally legitimate reason for separation of spouses. The obligations are determined according to the state laws rather than common sense or morality or church teaching. Annulment is a process whereby one status changes from having the status of married in the church to being unmarried as far as the church is concerned. Civil divorce usually has children be forced to lose access to one or both parents. Some of the time they no longer have an intact home. For Catholics, we aren't supposed to be making our own determination about whether divorce is tolerable in our situation. We have canon law that says only the bishop is the person who has the authority, the competence to determine whether one situation is such that it is tolerable to approach the government for a government state divorce. Let me jump over to a couple of other things here. In Carolyn's situation, she tells the listeners that the reason she got a divorce is because her marriage was invalid due to her husband's incapacity. And she did go on to say in the interview that he had gender dysphoria that definitely showed up around the time she got divorced. A public record shows that he legally changed his name almost a year to the month when after the divorce was issued. So he did take on a female name. But this raises questions. For Catholics, divorce is tolerable for the protection if there's a need to uphold one's rights. But the public records in Carolyn and her husband's case show that she's the one that petitioned for the divorce. It was a no-fault grounds. The husband denied the grounds, and he agreed to some settlement. And Carolyn ended up paying him about $3,200 a month. He ended up getting the ownership of the marital home. There were two other homes involved in the case. One was across the street and one was in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, I get it. If anyone who's been through divorce, you really don't want people fishing through your divorce decree. And I totally respect that one cannot know everything that went on just because you read the final outcome of divorce. But the questions I have and the issues I'm concerned about is that Carolyn gives the impression that divorce is a thing that Catholics just do in the government. But my point is Catholics are only supposed to be approaching the civil court after permission from one's bishop and for the purpose of protecting one's rights. So if someone has a legitimate reason for separation of spouses, and a church case of separation of spouses was never mentioned by Carolyn. A church case of separation of spouses is the process in which one's status goes from being together in one common marital home to being separated and no longer living in one common marital home. That is a canonical process that no one has the power to decide on their own. Only either one's bishop or a priest who's been given a signed mandate by one's bishop to exercise his authority, or a tribunal that's like the same people who do annulment cases. Only those authorities can even decide a case of separation of spouses. And then further above that, if there's a question of whether divorce is tolerable, only one's bishop or someone designated with a signed mandate by one's bishop has the authority to determine if it's tolerable to approach the divorce court. So she didn't mention all that stuff about divorce. She didn't make any mention of the canon law about cases of separation of spouses or who has the authority to decide whether you have a situation that's tolerable to get a divorce. She also didn't mention state annulment. I get it. That's not the question that Krista Fanek asked her. But state annulment is interesting to this discussion because civil divorce in the government is now no fault. Anyone who petitions for a divorce will always get it when they allege the no fault grounds. Some states say you have to wait 6 months before the no fault grounds they absolutely go into effect. Some states say they immediately go into effect. But all you have to say is, I want my divorce, and the state will force it on the other party and the children. State annulment is fault-based. State annulment has the same outcome in the sense that you had the status of being married according to the state, and then you change the status to being unmarried. But the obligations of the spouses, the parties towards each other and their children in an annulment could still be based on the person who was the cause of invalidity. So let me go play the next clip and let you hear what Carolyn says here.
Let me tell you what, though, guys. God does not hate people who are getting divorced. He doesn't hate people who have been divorced. When divorce is necessary and someone's going through that, or someone's pursuing an annulment, which means their marriage didn't happen in the first place and they want to get that ruling from the church, how do you process that? How do you process that and know that God is still with you? That you're still within the church? You're still...
But I still knew that it was time for a divorce. To go through divorce, especially as what you think of yourself as a faithful Catholic, it is humbling. It can be humiliating. Humiliation is not what God, we got divorced. Help. What do people need? We need, as we're going through separation and divorce, first of all, we need accompaniment. We need someone to walk with us.
I have two responses to this. One is the answer to Krista Fanek's question. How does one know when one is going through separation or divorce that one is in good graces with the church? You ask the church and you get a determination from the authority in the church that's set up by our own judiciary system in the church, which isn't one's own priest or one's friends or a life coach or anyone. It's a canonical forum where the church has the authority to investigate. And with an investigation, one has a clear conscience to know, I really do have a legitimate reason for separation of spouses, and the other spouse can get some instruction. The other thing I wanted to mention was Carolyn repeatedly uses these phrases like one goes through divorce, went divorce, got divorced, we this, we that. When the faithful hear divorce used in the plural, like we got divorced, it's kind of misrepresenting the situation. Like you wouldn't say we went through a burglary. It's like, well, were you the burglar or were you the person who was a criminal came into your home? With divorce for Catholics, there's a spouse who has a legitimate reason for separation of spouses based on the wrongdoing of the other. And it's just kind of not really presenting what's really happening. Most divorces are one spouse against the other, and the other who doesn't, if they don't want the divorce, they're coerced. So in the state record, it shows an agreement, a settlement agreement, but the defendant really never wanted divorce. They were just threatened by the state judiciary that if you don't agree, it's going to be forced on you anyway. So you can't afford a lawyer, you can't afford a trial, so you better settle. And is that what happened to Carolyn? Did she have a legitimate reason for permanent separation of spouses and to go to the civil court? Was Carolyn coerced? It's a mystery, but I'm going to go on to the next one.
If you go on most diocesan websites and put in the search divorce, nothing comes up. And that's
Wow.
a miss. It's a miss.
It's a miss on a third of the people.
And he just really gave me a fire in my belly to minister to those before, during, and after divorce. And so I'm a certified relationship coach and a divorce healing coach. And I've been equipped. I've got a degree in psychology and in spiritual direction, just a lot of background in my past life. And we walk through people before, during, or after divorce, and give them that accompaniment, that guidance, the spiritual guidance, the practical tools, and the spiritual guidance that people need.
Notably, Carolyn describes herself as someone who is qualified to help people discern whether they have a legitimate reason for separation and a legitimate reason to file for divorce. She does recognize that only the church can determine whether or not someone has an invalid marriage as far as the church understands marriage. But my concern is that listeners have no idea what criteria is Carolyn using to help people discern. Where did she get the authority? Does she have a mandate from every person who participates in her program? I mean, of course, we know she doesn't. And I know that Carolyn and Chris probably never heard of what I'm talking about, but I've collected all sorts of resources on Mary's Advocates, canon law commentaries, canon law, documents from different parts of the world, historical documents going back to the Council of Trent, showing that a party is not supposed to be her own judge to determine whether she has a situation where it's tolerable to go and get a civil divorce. More in a minute. I'm back. My lighting is a little different, if you've noticed, and I've got some more video clips to share with you and give you my response.
I get it. Like, no one wants to be that guy,
Right.
who the marriage failed.
Yeah, you don't want to be a failure.
Yeah, especially
And
that.
it's one thing to be a failure to yourself, where you feel you've failed. It's another thing to be a failure, to be seen by others that you esteem to be a failure. Because what are people going to think? That's a huge thing. But then even more striking is if I'm a failure before God. And that's what a lot of people suffer with, is they're so afraid and in shame because they feel like, is God mad at me? Will I even get to heaven now? I failed.
Wow. So yeah.
I agree with Carolyn that filing for divorce is a big deal, and people might wonder and be ashamed. But this is exactly why we have our Catholic code of canon law spelling out that no one is supposed to be their own judge and be left alone to figure it out. If we had canonical investigations about separation of spouses, the way I have found in my research that we are supposed to have, then someone doesn't need to worry about, is God going to be mad at me? Because someone does have an authority who's investigated, who has made a determination. Also, the person who did something wrong, justifying the separation of spouses, that person can get proper pastoral care and instruction to stop doing it. So let's move on to the next one.
After 30 years of marriage, he decided to present himself as a female. And 10 years later, He did return to his authentic masculine identity, but I still knew that it was time for a divorce. That not that he wasn't a good man, not that he didn't want to do the right thing, but that he had a lack of capacity. And so the divorce happened with much discernment and then an annulment. People thought, oh, had this great Catholic family and was esteemed and looked up to in that way. And then it all fell apart.
Something really doesn't sound right about what Carolyn is explaining. She says that her marriage is invalid because her husband had an incapacity. And she doesn't give the exact canon law number, but canon 1095-3 is applicable to those who have an incapacity to fulfill the essential obligations of marriage for psychic reasons. I'm paraphrasing it. And now I have in my hands 2 books that both have forewords by Cardinal Raymond Burke, who was in charge of the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. And there are some other books on my shelf behind me. But canon 1095-3, incapacity, is for people who were incapable of doing the essential obligations of marriage. But if somebody did do the essential obligations of marriage for 2 years or 10 years, well, then that proves they were capable. So it's really mysterious that Carolyn says she appeared as a good Catholic family amongst the community, people who knew she and her husband and her kids, and she never told anyone or any priest that her husband had these serious psychological problems that made him incapable, that evidently only appeared 30 years later. And then the fact that they appeared 30 years later, but then he was able to come out of it, just doesn't make sense. Let's go to the next one.
They kind of isolated me before they understood what all was going on, because I wouldn't speak about it. I felt like it was his business and that it wasn't mine to go to the parish and say, this is what's going on. I wanted to respect him in that way. And so some people thought that I was just leaving for not a good reason. And it was a scandal. And so, I think for the listeners, if you know someone who's going through divorce, just show up and be brave enough to say, hey, it must be a tough time. What can I do? Do you want to have a cup of coffee? You don't judge, you don't choose. You choose both. You love both.
But then what if one won't talk?
Loving someone includes speaking the truth, and very often it includes judging actions. And a lot of those who are on the receiving end of a no-fault divorce, the defendants who've done nothing wrong justifying permanent separation of spouses, would just love it if somebody would judge and determine that the divorce plaintiff doesn't have a legitimate reason to be permanently separating or getting the outcome arranged in no-fault divorce. So we do need judgments. It's just that the one competent to judge is not the individual. So what we say is, if you know someone who feels like they need to separate, or even beyond that, they need to have a permanent separation that's arranged by the divorce court, tell the person to petition the church in a formal case of separation of spouses to find out, 1, is there a legitimate reason for separation of spouses? 2, to get good pastoral care to the other spouse who may be doing something wrong that justifies separations. And they should get instruction. It's a good thing to tell people, stop doing what you're doing that's so terrible that it justifies separation of spouses. So let's see the next one.
But that he had a lack of capacity. And so the divorce happened with much discernment and then an annulment that was appealed actually from the diocese to the archdiocese.
He appealed it?
And all the way to Rome. Yes, he did.
Wow.
Because he felt like he was the defender of the bond. if we have reason to suspect that it may not be valid, we're not the judge and jury. We do not have the authority. The authority comes from Jesus handing the keys to Peter and the institutional church, which is not an organization, it's the mystical body of Christ. And therefore, the authority rests there, not in me to decide. And so we have to assume that our marriage is valid until proven otherwise.
I want to respond a little bit about the procedure that occurred in Carolyn's case. When a annulment respondent wants to appeal, if two annulments have been, if it started in La Crosse, which we don't really know for sure where it started, but Carolyn's divorce occurred in La Crosse, and that's where the two properties were across the street from each other. So if she went to the Tribunal of La Crosse to ask for annulment, during that period of time, the judicial vicar, the guy in charge of the tribunal, was a Monsignor Hund. Sorry if I don't know how to pronounce his name. I have the details in the blog. But he's got a YouTube video talking about annulments, and he says two things that I'm going to comment on. He says a divorce occurs when two people go to a civil magistrate because they have decided they cannot be in the same house. Does he not know about no-fault divorce, where a divorce defendant who's done nothing wrong for separation can be forcibly split from his children? Another thing he says is he's describing the essential elements of a marriage, and he says on his list for things that are required for valid marital consent, he says the people must commit to the project of making marriage a good life experience of their partner. So if Carolyn is thinking that, or she's giving other people guidance, and she's thinking that divorce is something that occurs when two people decide they can't live in the same home, that's not accurate. That's not what divorce is. But even more concerning to me is if Carolyn thinks that an essential property of marriage is that someone has to commit to a project of making marriage a good life experience of their partner. If this is the criteria that Carolyn is using, or that the tribunal in La Crosse was using, everyone who ever feels that they're not having the experience, the good life experience to their expectations, would think they have an invalid marriage. So that was one thing. Another thing is she says her husband appealed to the archdiocese. So depending on when her annulment occurred, if it was early 2015, all annulments automatically went to a second instance tribunal, and it would have been the Archdiocese in Milwaukee. Milwaukee has approved every single annulment that was submitted to them in first instance for 6 years. And I have that data in the links below in the blog. So what I'm getting at is that the appellate tribunal for Carolyn and the appellate tribunal that may have been used in a lot of the state of Wisconsin, they give annulments to 100% of the petitioners during that 6-year period. I don't have data after that because the Canon Law Society stopped publishing it in 2016. And finally, in different pockets of the world, in different pockets of time, the hierarchy of the church has corrected abuse of annulments. And right now we're living in a time when Pope John Paul II, St. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Cardinal Raymond Burke, who, as I said before, was in charge of the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura, but prior to being in charge of it, he was the defender of the marriage bond there, and EWTN's Father Murray, and Servant of God, Father John Hardin. These are just a few of the voices who have said there is an annulment problem. There is an abuse of the psychological grounds for annulment going on right now. So that's something to think about. Let me show you the next one.
Yeah, what did you experience help from your church? What was what was glaring as far as what the ways that everyone was failing you, and call it out. Don't feel bad calling it out, because I think all of us need to hear it, because we need to do better.
Yeah. Well, the truth is that I think we're right on the frontier of in the church of having divorce ministry. And for me, this was 15 years ago.
I challenge Carolyn's statement that we're on the forefront, or she's pioneering divorce ministry. Back in the 70s in Boston, an organization started that had outreach both in Canada and the United States, North American Conference of Separated and Divorced Catholics. I attended one of their national conferences at the University of Notre Dame in about 2004. And I was kind of surprised at what they were saying compared to what my research findings showed. So I reported my findings to the the Diocese of Fort Wayne South Bend. The following year, they conducted their own investigation, and the bishop of the Diocese of Fort Wayne South Bend was so displeased at what was going on under the direction of the North American Conference of Separated and Divorced Catholics that he instructed all the parishes in his own diocese that they can no longer publicize the existence of this conference. Thereafter, the organization moved their national conference to a different diocese. They also eventually changed their name. Also, another program that started around 2007 is the one by Rose Sweet. Rose Sweet has been on the board of a Christian entity that had some kind of divorce ministry, and it was all about waiting. Well, I could overly simplify, which probably isn't worth it. My only point is that I had some observations about Rose Sweet's program that I threw together in the old website of Mary's Advocates, and those are linked on my my blog here. And both Carolyn and Rose Sweet are people who are, or in their program, they're talking about encouraging folks to apply for annulments, but they don't seem to be too careful about what the grounds for annulment might actually be. But they're certainly not careful about the church's competence over cases of separation of spouses, not the state. And the church is never handed over to the state the power to determine whether there was a legitimate reason for separation of spouses, or to determine parties' obligations that overlap with morals. So let's go see the last one.
One of the things I say to people is, when you are in the season of waiting for annulment, it's the season of growth for you in submission and surrender and trust.
If someone wants an annulment and they're waiting for a determination, I get it, they're waiting, and it would be nicer to wait than certainly ignore the determination from the church. But I've seen situations where a person who was very sad to be separated and divorced, as a divorce defendant, who was adamant that he didn't do anything grave justifying permanent separation of spouses, his wife, he talked to a deacon, and the deacon tells him, well, just come back when your divorce is finalized and answer our questionnaire, and we'll give you your healing. So he did that. He contacted me several years later because he'd found out that they were blaming him for the annulment, saying his difficult upbringing was the grounds, and he never would have agreed to that. He never was alleging that he had some kind of problem with his intellect and will such that he couldn't understand the essential obligations of marriage and choose them. And they ended up issuing two different versions of the sentence. One version went to him that only gave the grounds in Latin, and the other version that was 6 pages long went to the respondent wife, who described, and that version of the sentence described the husband petitioner's grave, difficult upbringing. It was a tragedy. So the perspective that I bring to this whole discussion is, if Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Cardinal Raymond Burke, Father Murray of EWTN, Servant of God, Father John Hardin, if they're all correct when they're publicizing that there's something going wrong with the granting of annulment so easily here for psychological grounds, it could well be that the persons who don't go along with an annulment, even though it's been granted for psychological grounds on a petitioner or either party, it may be that those people are the ones that are standing in the truth. And those people really don't cause as much harm or scandal, because if someone wants an annulment and the annulment's denied and they're disgruntled, that the tribunal's wrong. Who are they to tell me how to live my life? I'm free to be married. I'm in my second marriage and I'm going to do it anyway. Those people may actually be committing adultery. But if on the flip side, someone was disillusioned about being abandoned, the divorce plaintiff got information that made them think, oh, I have an invalid marriage, I should apply for annulment. They live in one of those dioceses like Milwaukee that give annulments to every single petitioner. And they teach that one of the essential obligations of marriage, or the essential elements of marriage, is that you've got to commit to making the marital life a good experience for the other. Anyways, as I was saying, if a divorced defendant is in his heart of hearts believing, look, this annulment based on psychological grounds is, I want to say laughable. It doesn't sound very respectful, but maybe that's what the respondent sees when they get their own copy of the sentence. And if they go the rest of their life saying, I can't go along with this annulment, what harm are they doing? They're not committing adultery. They're continuing to pray for the other person who they believe is their spouse, and no harm done. So those are some thoughts that I hope to try to get some attention in the folks at EWTN, Carolyn Klika, Chris Stefanik. Carolyn, I would love to have an online discussion with you. Maybe you invite some of the people that you've helped. I could invite some of the people that I've helped. And we're going to have something in common if we're both trying to do God's will. So see what he brings out of it.